Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show. And I am so happy to introduce my next guest. This is Professor Lydia Goehr, and she is a professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy in Columbia University in New York. Very esteemed scholar. And I have always wanted, because the show has always been very technical, talking about music theory, talking about music history, and the specifics of classical improvisation and older pedagogical processes, partimento, and that sort of thing. But I was always fascinated at the philosophical underpinnings of why these marked changes in behavior, these sudden, really strong opinions regarding aesthetics happened in the 19th century, and really we live in the echo or the shadow of a lot of this still in the 21st century. And it's a good thing to understand this. And who better than a professor of philosophy? So Professor Goehr, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So I had a really good time reading your book, The Imaginary Museum. First of all, give the title of the book. It was really a fascinating book. And why don't you just introduce yourself, a little background, how you actually came to write something like that?
Okay, well, the book is called The Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, an essay in the philosophy of music. I wrote it during the 1980s as part of my PhD work at Cambridge University in England. I was brought up in England. I came from a German Jewish musical family, and so had a very strong education in music and other German matters. And when I went into philosophy, I was initially interested in changes in philosophical method. And someone suggested, different ways of approaching philosophy, that's what I meant. And someone suggested that I read a book by Roman Ingarden on the ontology of the musical work, which I did. And unfortunately, it was only in German at the time, and my German actually wasn't very good. I hadn't been brought up as a native German speaker in England. And so while I was reading the book, I was learning the language and learning to translate the thoughts. And by the time I'd finished, a publication came out of the translation, so I could have saved a lot of time. But it was a good educational process. And I came to the idea of writing about the philosophy of music from the feeling that with this enormous musical background I had as a violinist mostly, that there was a kind of lack in the philosophy of music toward the practice itself. And I was quite taken aback by the way in which people approach the philosophy of music, asking questions, but they didn't care much about the history of their examples or where their examples came from. They just picked them out. But I noticed, apart from Roman Ingarden, who was Polish and therefore chose Chopin as his example, that most people dealing with the question, what is a musical work? Why do we think about musical works? Always went back to the example of Beethoven. And they said, what is a musical work? Take the example of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. So I chose to ask a question, and my question was, why Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? And by the time I'd answered that question, the why Beethoven question, I had shifted away from a kind of a priori metaphysical inquiry toward a way of doing philosophy that was really bound up with the historicity of the examples, how it was in the Beethoven period that people began to think about music in terms of producing works. And that meant well-formed, through composed musical works that couldn't be changed in performance. You really couldn't even adapt the instrumentation. You couldn't adapt it to occasion or place. It became one way of thinking about a perfected masterpiece
Is
of
that
music.
Werktreue?
That's the notion of Werktreue, a German notion of being true to the work in performance, playing it as it was composed. And we knew from the 18th century that Bach and Handel, Haydn, Mozart were masters of music. But they also adapted their music quickly. They had to write for occasions. If it was in the court or the church, they had to write available instruments. Performances weren't yet very perfect. And so I produced a quite strong thesis for which I got lots of flack and trouble. And that was that Bach had not intended to compose musical works. And people were enormously irritated with me because they thought that I was saying Bach didn't compose music.
Yeah.
But on those who liked what I was saying felt suddenly released that early music didn't have to anymore conform to the conventions set up in the post-Beethoven period.
So you're saying he wasn't composing in that 19th century conception of a masterwork. That was not his
That's right.
prerogative.
We would say he produced masterpieces today,
Yes.
because after 1800, people began to produce collected editions of Bach or Mozart and so on. And so they give them Kirchel numbers or opus numbers, and they have titles, and they become scored so that they can no longer be changed. But this really occurs after Beethoven. And even now, of course, there's so much fluidity and change in the actual practice. But for the sake of philosophy, I marked a really strong, what's called a conceptual break or paradigm change. And I did this in the 1980s. I published my book in 1992. I was very fortunate with its reception. It pretty much made my career. I still get invited. You see, I still get invited 40 years later to talk about that book, as if I didn't do anything else in my life. But, you know, it's nice to have written one book that people read. I mean, you know, that's already good.
Yes.
And I was marking this period of modernity around 1800 as a strong change in institutional norms, new forms of authority, new forms of power, new forms of, like, imprisonment, in the way that people behaved in concert halls. But the most important thing for me was
in the
that
80s? What was happening? What was happening in the 80s then, in terms of concert halls?
Well, in the 1980s, it was a period of what people call postmodernism, where people were questioning post-Second World War the norms of authority that had kept so much in place. I mean, this started of course, back to Plato, but there was a lot going on in the 1920s. A lot going on in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, of course, especially, with new forms of avant-gardism, new forms of electronic music, new forms of technology that really changed the way that people produced music, heard music, distributed music. And then in the 1980s, there was a real paradigm break against structures of authority, narratives of history that made it look as if there was this sort of determined, godlike, teleological drive that was bringing music to its condition of the production of masterpieces. And I just happened to come in when I was in my 20s, I have to tell you. I just happened to hit the moment when questioning the historicity of the work concept just seemed to be the right thing to do. And I just hit the moment quite unintentionally, just when it needed hitting. And I was very lucky. And it changed the way that I did philosophy forevermore. I became someone very interested in the history and politics and of social practice. And I never shifted from that again. It didn't find me favor with hardcore, tough philosophers who wanted metaphysical systems to obtain, despite what happened in the history or practice of music. But it gave me a good reputation in all the other fields, so I was quite lucky.
Now you mentioned Plato, and now this is
Yeah,
so important. Okay, so this is, I feel like these two gentlemen here, Plato and Aristotle. I mean, they
yeah.
obviously they knew each other, but can you just frame the work concept in light of these two figures? And is this an old thing? I mean, like, how old does this go back?
Um, well, I think the way that people do the metaphysics, or what's called the ontology of the musical work, um, adopted ideas about Platonism or the Aristotelian models, or different. They used these names for positions like Platonism,
Mm.
as I don't think they have much to do with Plato or Aristotle. I regard Plato and Aristotle as remarkable thinkers of how to do philosophy. I mean, Socrates is walking around the world asking people, how do you become virtuous? And everybody thinks they have an answer. And he says, really, you think you know? It's sort of, it's the way that he engaged philosophy and the way that he promoted the forms as a constant alert against what he called the rivers of muddy opinion is extremely interesting. But putting aside ancient philosophy, in the philosophy of music, it became very convenient for some philosophers to say musical works like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, they are abstract types of which performances are their examples. And as all examples must be, the closer they are to reaching the perfect ideal, the better the performance. And so, what it means to produce a perfect performance of a Beethoven symphony. And we all know that if everybody was just striving after some kind of mathematical perfection of a Beethoven symphony, interpretation would be a really boring enterprise. They just simply count, yeah, you got all the notes right, the rhythms accorded with the metronome markings, and everyone would say, but God, it was boring. I mean, this is really not what we want. So you have the Furtwängler's Beethoven and Toscanini's Beethoven and this Rattle's Beethoven. You have so many Beethovens, and we want interpretation to have much more substance and interest than merely precision or perfectibility of the example. And then Aristotelians said, look, we don't have these abstract types. We have norms and we have rules, and to guide us, we have types that are internal to the practice. And so you get a kind of Aristotelian model. And then people endlessly debate which model is right. My argument was that this modeling doesn't really, again, account for the historicity of the examples, because the history of interpretation of, say, Beethoven has changed drastically through the 19th century. What it meant to interpret a work, what it means, what happened to improvisational elements, what happened to the performance when the pianist or the conductor became more famous than the composer. So we'll have Toscanini's Beethoven might be more famous than Beethoven.
Tied to this concept is also the concept of the artist, the genuine artist, the genius. Let me quote something I read from your book from E.T.A. Hoffman. And it's actually from a fictional story that he wrote with Johannes Kreisler. The genuine
Yeah.
artist lives only for the work, which he understands as the composer understood it, which he now performs. He does not make his personality count in any way. All his thoughts and actions are directed towards bringing into being all the wonderful, enchanting pictures and impressions the composer sealed in his work with magical power. A magical power. So he's E.T.A. Hoffman, huge romantic figure. I think about 1776 to 1822, very the beginning of the 19th century. Is he kind of representative of the thoughts that's happening, the idea of the artist? Is that going through a transition out of the 18th century?
Yeah, I mean, one of the sort of comebacks or counterpoints to my focus on the work concept when I wrote The Imaginary Museum came from theorists who said it wasn't the work that was so important, it was the change in the status of the artist. That the subject change, the person who did it, that was more significant than the object produced. I had focused on the object. In a good dialectical way, you'd say both come together. You can't have one without the other, which is what, in fact, I said. But anyway, the point was that you had these really significant changes in the notion of an artist being released from courts, from service to the king, from service to church, with the idea of a new kind of bourgeois figure emerging for a new audience, taken away from aristocracy. So you have what Habermas calls the emergence of the public sphere. And with that comes the museums, the concert halls, and then you have to have a bourgeois artist. And the bourgeois artist became in another book I wrote recently called a bohemian artist, the artist who lives alone for art, that he doesn't consider his life important except how many women he can get into his studio. It's the romanticization of the artist as not having care for the world, for dress, for the comforts of living, but you just produce the art and you tend to starve and you die young, and you
Byron.
become Byron, Chopin, you have to die young. The most important thing about the emergence of the artist around 1800 is that it borrows a lot of theological language.
Okay,
The notion of
so
genius originating, being godlike, being inspired, producing something out of nothing. It's all very theological, but it's made secular as you get your programs for concert halls, and audience behavior becomes like going to church, respectful, divine, treue, faithful, fidelity. So the theological background is crucial in this story.
can we speak about mimesis?
Mimesis.
Mimesis. Okay, so you write in the book, initially, the primary function of fine art was to imitate nature as well as possible. And the romantic aesthetic turned the table around, and the notion of a human spirit was incorporated into a grand concept of nature, and the arts, with their special powers of abstraction, could reveal the essence and generality of nature. And so there's a clear break. And I see someone like Hegel would say something like, no natural being is able, as art is, to express the divine ideal. And so that is a
Right.
break, right? Is that not what people used to think before this the Romantic age?
Well, the way the grand romantic narrative or idealist narrative works is the idea that in prior to 1800, these are all just placeholders. It doesn't actually happen on December 1st, 1800.
January 1st.
Right, yeah, January 1st. Oh, wow, the world changed.
Exactly.
But it feels like it sometimes.
Yeah.
But we say that 2001, the world changed, as if it
Yeah.
had no prior history or post history. So I think what happens is that the idea of enlightenment is the increasing rise of humanity over nature, and with the rise of the humanity coming over nature, what is produced by humanity takes over from what is given as divine in nature. And so where nature gave the rule to art in Kant's terms, in the Critique of Judgment, it turns around. Art suddenly is giving the rule to nature. Humanity is giving the rule to nature. And so there's a shift. And it's not that humanity doesn't have its own nature, but it's the sort of embodiment of the divine figure. And you can see this is a very Christian notion of nature. It's when divine nature is represented in the embodiment of a person, and that's the figure of Jesus Christ. So it's not about nature in terms of natural rules, natural norms for how people are in the world. It's the rise of an embodied figure. So in the 18th century, you're seeing a lot of new philosophies of art that are putting the sculpture, the Greek sculpture, the body of Apollo or King David as godlike into the center of the Museum of Art. And so landscape becomes secondary to that. I mean, there's enormous landscape painting in the 19th century, extraordinary landscape.
Could you elaborate?
History painting, but there's a kind of centrality given to the figure of a person, and that corresponds to the figure of the artist.
Could you explain a little bit more about that traditional view? So, I mean, even the Renaissance produced a lot of, I guess you could say, humanistic art, where the statue of David, and there's a lot of naturalism portrayed there. I think if you go a little bit earlier to perhaps Fra Angelico, where the paintings are not almost otherworldly in a transcendental way, but then you have the Renaissance.
But that's the thing. Yeah.
And the Renaissance, you have more human-looking people, and very perfectly proportioned.
Yeah, but you're still seeing a kind of divination of the nature in the human nature in the paintings, with Apollo, or with King David, or statue of David, or you're seeing figures that are set into contexts that carry religious iconography, notions of pointing. People pointing to the heavens when they're playing musical instruments. So you've still got a very theological, divine nature operating within these paintings in so many ways. And that, of course, is a mixture of antiquity plus biblical theology mixing in the Renaissance. But as you go up in the centuries, people say that it becomes more and more secular, so that Romanticism is then the moment where the divination is so very much embodied in a secular world. And some people say that's the end of the divine, because it's become secularized. Some people say it's the perfect accord of the secular and sacred. But people see a break in that moment with the domination of a secular modernity, This is a narrative. I'm telling you how the story is told. It is way more complicated than I'm capturing it, but just to give you the outline. And you see this, and so you get in Hegel, in Kant, in Marx, and in Nietzsche, a looking back to an antique world that is being reborn with a new spirit in the 19th century. But the new spirit is under the condition of a new secular culture, secular modernity. So there's this big question: will that secular world carry the spirit of the sacred, or will we end up in world wars and everything go to hell, so to speak?
Okay. So
Yeah.
now you mentioned Immanuel Kant, and he had some interesting things to say. For instance, he like his dividing of aesthetic judgments between the beautiful and the sublime. And it's interesting. He says he assigns music a low place for, as you put it, idiosyncratic reasons, recognizing that music is a beautiful play of sensations, but which are transitory rather than lasting. And with music, one is forced to listen whether one wants to or not. And the plastic arts, what is that? The plastic arts.
So in the 18th century, there was this emerging division from Lessing and Herder, philosophers like that, who talked about the arts that had objective form, statues, painting, and so on. They could be seen, they existed in one time and place. You could go and pick them up. And then you had what were called the energetic or performance arts, like dance and music. Poetry was different because it was also with the pure word. So you start to get a division between the different arts. And people said, even in Leonardo said this in the Renaissance, that the problem with music is that it doesn't last. It's a transitory art. And it's only when it's captured in painting does it attain a kind of eternal presence by the act of painting music, like still life painting. Still life painting, you see fruits and flowers decaying under the ordinary conditions of mortality. These things die, they mold, they get old, and they die. But the painting preserves them with a kind of life. Even if it's a decaying life, it preserves them forever. They can be seen. So there was a big emphasis put on what was eternal and what was transitory. And if you saw music as either just decorative wallpaper, as Kant did, or as a beautiful play of sensation, a beautiful play of sensations, which, however, didn't last, then it wasn't going to find a very high place in a philosophical system that put its emphasis on what lasts, endures, is eternal. There's your theological moment again of what lasts forever, eternal, like after we all die, we go off in, not the dust, but the rest, our spirit goes off and not. So, but then, of course, Schopenhauer came along after Kant and said, let's turn the ladder upside down. Music isn't the lowest of the arts, it's the highest, precisely because it captures the unending drive of the world will. And it's that unending drive. So music isn't cut up into works as such, but there's a kind of musical drive, like a spirit that is pushing itself like a natural drive through everything that moves, everything that lives and dies. That's another notion of music. That's a kind of driving spirit of music.
Okay,
So
wait.
Chopin,
So,
yeah,
wait, hold on a second.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
it's
Well,
I,
you
so
asked for it.
so I it's
Mm,
important, I think, to maybe point out. I mean, Schopenhauer was. I mean, Hegel was some sort of pantheist, right? So he had an idea of an immanent, like God was in things and everything, and he permeated. Pan is everything, and theist is religion. So is Schopenhauer, and is that influencing then their philosophy of music? So when Schopenhauer speaks of was he a pantheist as well? And did he? Because I understand that he researched Eastern religions, monist and pantheistic.
Indian. Pantheism is a very strong force in 19th century Romanticism for many
Theosophy
people. But here's the thing. Here's a really important point, I think. And that is that when they think about some kind of natural spirit of musicality as a driving force of nature, or something, they're thinking more like Pythagorean thinkers thought, or Plato thought that there's some kind of harmony in the universe, in the cosmos. And so you have a kind of driving force going through the world that we call music, but it's not the same as the art of music. And so I differentiate between what's called the condition of music, the kind of cosmic condition of music, musicality it was called around 1800s, with the notion of the art of music, which is this, what musicians do. And you could think that in terms of musicality, there was nothing higher. But who had the claim on musicality? It wasn't musicians. It was philosophers. And theological people who could get into the harmony of everything. So in the 19th century, you get a real muddle because philosophers are...
I don't think that's a bad thing, though.
It's
after all, Beethoven read Schiller and was very influenced by him. No,
but the point is that muddle between the art of music and the condition of music in the 19th century produced a muddle that made music flourish as the greatest art of the century. And even though people were muddling up all the claims, music benefited because everybody thought that music now was the greatest art. And so you get Nietzsche, it says the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music. And who makes a claim on music? Wagner. He says, I'm going to give you a total work of art out of the spirit of music. And he just happened to make the spirit of music equal to his score. And so now the art of music is the same as the spirit of music. And this caused such an interesting confluence of claims in the 19th century that this is why we have 19th century as the great age of music.
So there's a quote that you mentioned in a lecture. You said, quote by Walter Pater, and they said this is representative.
Walter Pater.
And it's all the arts aspire to the aesthetics of music. And you said something along.
No. Oh. All the arts aspire to the condition of music.
Okay.
And he said all the arts constantly aspire. The art he thought most successful in constantly aspiring to condition of music was Renaissance painting. He said this in 1872, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy year. So it's an amazing thing that you have Pater claiming this, but I did a twist on this question. I said, if all the arts constantly aspire to the condition of music, does the art of music constantly aspire to the condition of music? And if it aspires to the condition of music, is there a way that it can fail? So can the art of music fail to aspire to meet the condition of music? And that was the paradox of the 19th century. In a nutshell, in one question, that is the biggest paradox of my entire field. There you are. There you have it.
Now, react to this quote by Schopenhauer. Music was, or well, I'm not, maybe it's just like the gist of it. Music was the most important of the arts because it didn't belong to the side of
Yeah,
representation, but more to the side of the will. Now, is that
yeah,
correct, or
that's
is that
yeah.
what do you think of that?
Except he he made even more of a muddle of the whole story because when he denied music representation, then you're saying, what exactly does he mean by music when it's on the side of the will? It can't be a music that's heard in the world because that would be in the world of representation. So he divides the world of will and he says, you see the world from the perspective of will and the world from the perspective of representation. If the arts are in representation and music's here, then you can't have a music that's actually heard in the world. So when then he said, actually, there is a wonderful music and it embodies the drive of the will, he actually made it representational. And everybody thinks that he took Beethoven, like everybody else, as his model. But what did he take in 1819 when he wrote this book? Rossini's operas. And like Hegel. Hegel was a Rossini boy, not a Beethoven boy.
Really?
They
Hegel
didn't know
liked
about
Rossini?
Beethoven.
Wow.
Yeah, well, Hegel wrote almost nothing about music, but Hegel's Aesthetics, which was written by his student Otto and turned into a 3,000-page tome that everybody reads today, was full of Otto's updatings of Hegel's views from his lectures. And if you actually read the lecture notes, there's like 3 pages on music, whereas Otto turned it into 90 pages. And the trouble is in teaching Hegel is you have to teach a text that he didn't write.
Right.
It's like the problems you teach. You read texts of history that were not actually written but rewritten later, and so, but they're the ones,
Yeah.
yeah, and they're the ones that become canonic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so it's just, but this music condition of music model is my I spend a lot of time with that model.
I think in the practical order, the muddle really affects really much of the today. I mean, when
Yeah.
we see this battle a lot in music education, where well, everyone wants to play classical works in according to the
Mm-hmm.
work concept, and you get well, maybe it's a lot actually more opened up now. More people are open to improvisation, and there's a big culture change now towards classical improvisations really taking off, especially among younger people. But decades ago, it was extremely hostile. I mean, the idea that you would dare to improvise over a master work, and it could be career ending. You could not get a recording contract, or it was just very crazy. So in the practical order, it still has legs, and it really is still going. In fact, if anything, it's still going strong.
Well, it's going strong because of my work and other people's work that put into question the idea of Werktreue. And after the 1980s, into the 1990s, and now into this century, um, people said, okay, so if the authority of the work concept no longer holds, this frees us up to do much more creative productions. You see this in opera all the time when they shift bits around and they change the opera and they even change the text, and they intervene with directors' little bits and so on. And you say, and some of them work brilliantly, and some of them are catastrophic. Some of the changes,
Oh,
some
right.
of
Is that
that
like when
you
you take
get,
a is that like when you take a Mozart opera, but no, it's actually in the Industrial Revolution, or it's like in a different time
yeah, yeah,
period?
yeah,
That's okay.
yeah. Yeah, you produce what are called non-authentic performances because you don't believe in authenticity. So what you do is you say, I'm going to make for a really updated, interesting production. And I'm all for that. I'm totally for it. It's just that, 80% of the time it's crap and 20% of the time it's great. But then, there's something called Sturgeon's Law, which is 99% of most things are crap. So, there's a lot that goes wrong, and you can strive your entire life to get something perfectly right, and still something's missing if you don't bring some kind of spontaneity or improvisational element. Or people say, I've heard this, I want something new, give me something different about your Beethoven sonata. I mean, I've gone back to the violin, so I'm now really thinking a lot about philosophy of performance practice, and I think constantly about what it means to play a Beethoven sonata. And, there's me with my work concept, deconstruction of my work concept, saying, do I try to get it all right? Under what condition? How am I doing this? And it's an ongoing issue for every performer. And the point is that as a living problem for performers, it makes for the most diverse performances and the most fantastically exciting practice. You have a Beethoven's Fifth. I went to a concert in Scandinavia to comment on a composer who had reversed Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and written it sort of backwards or written it in a different way. And so, did this work? Did this not work? You could turn the score upside down, or you could do the latest one. You can do La Bohème by making Mimi survive at the end. She gets cured as a kind of feminist antidote to the death of women in every opera. So there's so many exciting things that you can do, and some are conceptually telling, some are empty. Some are very, very interesting, but musically horrible. Some are musically fantastic and completely banal as a concept. You got the whole gamut, but thank God for that, because then we have a really exciting practice.
Okay, so
And
you are. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead. So, no. So I just wanted to
no,
ask. You're an expert of the German tradition of philosophy, and so in this channel of mine, we really investigated the older people got dissatisfied in music education, so they were looking at other traditions, and they happened upon the Italian tradition, which is more scholastic and okay. So long story short, I was reading like a textbook, a history of philosophy from the scholastic perspective, and it is absolutely hostile to anything like in the. I mean, not even Descartes is safe. So Descartes, Kant, Hegel, it is
yeah,
blasting all of these people, and you are, of course,
yeah,
no stranger to like fighting in philosophy. I'm sure you need,
yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah.
So, would you have any perspective on perhaps the scholastic, neo-scholastic perspectives on art and aesthetics?
I mean, I've taught quite a bit in medieval aesthetics and so on, from the Italian tradition. Even Umberto Eco wrote a very good book called Beauty in the Middle Ages, which I highly recommend. It's very interesting. But I'm not an expert in scholasticism. I've written, I know the tradition of Boethius and so on, and Augustine and stuff, but I couldn't comment on that particularly. But one thing I will tell you about countries, including Italy, that weren't dominated by the work concept in the same way, say, Germany was, it emerged in Germany, is that when you go to performances, say, of opera in Italy, even today, the audiences participate like it's a popular concert. They shout people off the stage. You know, if you go to a Jewish film festival in New York, all the old ladies in the audience will say, "Get married! Why aren't you married? Why aren't you doing that?" And they, and many audiences participate in watching films, even though it's on a screen.
Oh, that's
And
very
I
different
remember
from
going,
classical concert, modern culture. You
yeah,
can't even
yeah,
cough,
right.
you know,
None
you're
of,
giving out cough
yeah,
drops.
right. Yeah, yeah. So when I went to AIDA in Verona, and people were screaming, "Get the tenor off the stage! He's terrible. He can't sing. He can't act." And it was really funny. And when you mishmash an opera, the audiences, they know this, like they know their popular culture. They know every line of their operas, and they sing along and they join in the choruses and they call for encores, of choruses or a solo and so on. So there's a lot more adaptability in performance when you're not burdened by this sort of the cough drops form of attendance. No noise, don't move,
So I
don't
think you
react.
can clap between movements, I think, right? In that situation.
Only just. Yeah. No, in Italy you can clap even in the middle of movements when at opera. But I remember once going to a Wagner opera at the Metropolitan Opera in New York and being shushed when I clapped during Parsifal, and I did it deliberately because I went like this to say, we're not in church. But people were so devout.
Yeah,
They
so
were
that's
so,
right.
they were so much in a temple of devotion to
Mm.
Wagner's Parsifal. They wouldn't even let anyone applaud during the acts. And so I went like this and everyone said, shh. And I said, I know what I'm doing. And I did this again in Berlin recently. No, it wasn't recently, about 10 years ago, at a John Cage performance of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of
This,
silence, where
yeah.
he says, be open to all the noises. So my friend and I sat in the audience making noises. And, we go click, click, tap, tap, bang, bang, and people go, shh, shh. And I say, what are you shushing for? You're not meant to, what are you shushing?
I guess you were meant for that work. I mean, all the sounds, right?
Yeah,
That's it's essentially what
yeah,
he was asking. Whatever happens is
yeah,
that's the
happened, right?
conception, right? So,
Mm,
well, what about what can I ask? The 19th century composers themselves, did they buy into this
yeah,
in the sense, like you said, that the philosophers were at the
yeah.
steering wheel, right? They were at the steering wheel. Did the musicians really like how unanimous was this opinion of them, like with the work concept, with the genius concept? Did they think of themselves as geniuses? Did they think of their works as masterworks? And what was that like in the 19th century?
Well, there's not one answer, but that it's very much I mean, all the paradoxes are there that people need to eat, so they make compromises, they do adapt their works. Notation didn't attain a precision. We know all the arguments about Beethoven's metronome markings.
Hmm.
Did he mean 89 or 88? And you can imagine musicologists going to war over one metronome marking.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah. So, no, of course, notational precision was very difficult. There was lots of mishmashing at concerts still. There was still the salon concert. There was still occasional uses. So people bought into the rhetoric when it suited them and ignored it when it
Economically.
didn't.
Yep.
Yeah, like normal life. Um, I mean, what's interesting is that it really does feel like the musical world changed. That people said performance of a work, a score of a work, the work really attained a currency in the newspapers, in magazines, in criticism, in the public consciousness of the musical world. There really was, I think, a paradigm change. But in terms of the everyday living, lots continued as it had always been. And so you can either stress the continuities or stress the rupture. When I wrote my imaginary museum, I stressed the rupture. And people have quarreled with me for 40 years. Oh no, it was a bit more continuous. Oh no, it was 1772, not 1800, or it was 1742. And you say, yeah, I stress the rupture because it changed the way to do philosophy of music. That was the point of my book. And it changed quite a lot of thinking, even in musicology, which was nice. But it didn't mean that I really meant that, January 1st, the
Right,
world
right.
changed.
So just
Yeah.
two quick questions. One is on instrumental music. So instrumental music. Now, just on this, it doesn't have text. It doesn't imitate nature in that regard. But people say, so how does that relate to the work concept? Is that part of nature? Does it touch the divine in that regard? So instrumental works that don't have text.
Excellent question. So you have a work concept in painting and poetry earlier than you do with the musical work, I think. And what you have is the idea that I could write music to accompany a poem, and the poem would take priority, and I would produce a song by giving it music. So you'd say, well, you've got a poem, you've got an opera where you've got music. In the 18th century, you're getting that. So while music is in service to another art, you can have the work concept defined by the other art, by a painting or a poem or by a novel or something like that. Novel is more difficult. But in the 1800 with the work concept, I very much stress that the change was when you also get a freeing up of the idea of what's musical, what the art of music is. And the most separated, that separability thesis, I call it, the separation of music from text, from occasion, from court, from king or queen, occurs when you get the emergence of genres of the sonata and symphony that are called purely instrumental. So suddenly you get a totally through composed work of music for which there are only musical instruments playing the notes. So opera wouldn't count as a work until Wagner comes and says, okay, we got the Beethoven work concept. I'm now putting it back into opera to produce the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. And that was key. He took that actually from Schelling and early 19th century thinkers, but around Beethoven. But it's a key moment. So you've got to have that break with the symphony and the sonata. And the symphony became more paradigmatic than the sonata, even though the sonata form dominated in terms of music theory.
Now, the last question is: surely the once you had recordings, that must have sent work concept to the moon. I mean, that's because now it's no longer transitory. You can actually preserve not just the work,
Perfect.
but a performance can also be a kind of work concept, right? So let's end off on that.
You get the most perfect recordings, the canonic performances like the Toscanini, the Furtwängler recording. This becomes a paradigm for the recording of the symphony itself. So you can have no Beethoven Fifth Symphony without this recording of it. And this occurred in the 1920s. And in fact, one objection to my book came from Leo Treitler, the brilliant musicologist, Treitler, who said, in fact, I would say that Werktreue only emerges properly with the advent of recording. So he makes your point. You can only get a really perfected work concept for the distribution and rigidification of the culture with recording technology.
Well,
that was a brilliant claim, because that came just at the moment when the authentic performance practice for early music came in as well. So it plays to a incredibly fascinating history.
Well, I can
and
say
there
at the
you
end
have it.
I can say at the end of this conversation, I'm not a fan of the work concept, but I am
You
so.
should be. You should be. You should be.
Oh,
It did amazing things. It did amazing things, and it did amazing harm. But mostly, it did amazing things.
well, thank you so much, Professor Goehr, for coming in and sharing your expertise. I really appreciated it. And hopefully, we can just talk again about more of the topics about music. You're a really fascinating person. And we want to give some final plugs before we end off. Do you want to just mention your recent work that you're working on, or recent publications? Because we only talk, like you mentioned, this is something that keeps getting brought up once in a while. So you want to mention your other research too?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've written books on Wagner and several things on Wagner. I've written books on Adorno and problems of recording technology. I've just finished a book on the films of David Lean and the role of music, because my grandfather composed the music for David Lean's film Great Expectations in 1946. And then I also just wrote a very, very, very long book called Red Sea, Red Square, Red Thread, which is about the history of Bohème, the history of Bohemia. And it's a lot about the relationship of painting to music. So I'm most proud of my red book, Red book. And my next project will be to write about violin practice, the practice of learning the violin again as a woman of advanced age.
You should check out Partimento, Professor Goehr. You would be really interested about that. It's a really, I think you would enjoy yourself. But anyway, Professor Goehr, brilliant woman. Thank you for sharing your expertise, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.